is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks, and today I am here for one of my final wrap-up videos for the year 2023. This is going to be my top 10 nonfiction reads of 2023. I have already done my favorite fiction reads of 2023, which you can find up here, as well as my least favorite reads of 2023, which you can also find up here. So I figured I would separate nonfiction because it's super hard to judge nonfiction against fiction. And I had some really stellar standout nonfiction reads that I wanted to highlight. So here we are. I am going to give you a couple honorable mentions, and then I'm going to give you a quick top 10 list. So I have two honorable mentions today. First up is Stranger in the Woods by Michael Finkel. This is a book about a man who is a hermit, and he lives way out in the wilderness, super far away from society, and he is basically isolated for many, many years. And he survives by hunting and scavenging, but he also survives on theft. So he breaks into like cabins and little like towns along the forest, and he just steals tiny bits of things. He doesn't really steal anything major, only the necessities. He steals little bits of food, propane, things like that. Eventually he is caught for the theft and he is incarcerated, and this just kind of follows his whole story. I found this book really, really interesting. There is a part of me that deeply relates to a person walking out into the wilderness and just like cutting themselves off from society. As a hiker and a backpacker and a lover of the wilderness, I really felt that deep in my soul. But what follows is a really fascinating exploration of what happens to somebody like this man who's a complete hermit, who's been socially isolated, as they become famous, as they're thrown in prison, as they're reconnected with their family. All of that was really, really interesting. The only reason that this book didn't make it into my top 10 is actually because of the author that wrote this book. I felt like he was a bit intrusive at certain points. There's a point where the gentleman in the book basically makes it clear that he doesn't want to be harassed anymore by the media. He doesn't care about the books, the TV shows, any of it. He just wants to be left alone on his family farm. And I feel like the author is very honest about how he approached the situation, but I don't think that he handled it in the best way possible. He came across a little pushy and like he was ignoring some of the boundaries that were being set. So I really disliked that part of the book and that aspect of things, and that's what kept it from being inside my top 10. But overall, I will say it was a very interesting read. If you're interested in nature, if you're interested in human psychology, if you're interested in hermits, this is a fascinating read. My second honorable mention is Pulling the Chariot of the Sun by Shane McCrae. This is a short memoir about Shane McCrae's own life, and he is a biracial man. His mother was white, his father was black, and his white grandparents are extremely racist. At a very young age, they kidnap Shane and raise him to essentially hate the black part of himself. They tell him that his father abandoned him, that he didn't love him, and they teach him white supremacy essentially. And it's many years before Shane escapes that and reconnects with his father and finds out that all of those lies were completely untrue. And I just thought that this was such a heartbreaking situation. We're reading about, a young child experiencing this during their formative years, and it's a horrible, horrible situation. The only reason that this book is an honorable mention instead of inside of my top 10 is because it was a very short memoir, and I wanted more detail on what happened to Shane after he reconnects with his father, because I feel like this kind of cuts off right at that point, but we don't see how Shane recovered from this indoctrination that he'd experienced. Was there therapy? Was there support groups? Was it just him and his dad working through things? There was a lot left that I wanted to know. I had so many questions and I just wanted more. So this is a very interesting and powerful memoir, but I think it could have gone a little bit further. Of course, I'm saying that as somebody from the outside. Shane obviously has the right to determine how much of his story he wants to share, and I'm grateful for the part that he did share. I just found myself left wanting at the end. Number 10 is Trail of the Lost by Andrea Lankford. This was a book that I read in December, one of the last books that I read in 2023, in fact. And this is a nonfiction book about Andrea's experiences working with search and rescue. So Andrea did actually work for search and rescue and participated in many search and rescues on a professional aspect. But after she retired from search and rescue, she got brought into some cases on a volunteer basis. And this is really about the volunteers that work along the Pacific Crest Trail trying to find hikers that have gone missing. In particular, this book focuses on 3 different missing hikers and what might have potentially happened to each of them. It talks about how the families are dealing with the hikers being missing, about, volunteers on the internet that are scouring images looking for clues, all sorts of different aspects of volunteer search and rescue. And as a person who hikes quite a bit and somebody who has also volunteered for search and rescues, I found this fascinating. There was a ton of really interesting information. It was a fast-paced book. There wasn't necessarily as much resolution as I would have liked, but I kind of understand that that's not the point of the book. The book is teaching you about search and rescue and volunteers and how we could use these volunteers more effectively to find people. If you're interested in hiking, nature, search and rescue, criminal investigation, things like that, this would be a great book for you to pick up. Number 9 is The Sister by Yoon-Lee. This is a book about Kim Yo-jong, the younger sister to Kim Jong-un, who is the dictator of North Korea. This is a really interesting book because it doesn't just tell us about who Kim Yo-jong is. It talks about whether our perception of her is sexist or not. And that was a fascinating topic for this book. So often in the media, Kim Yo-jong is portrayed as being the sensible, sane, rational sister who is trying to calm her brother's violent and chaotic tendencies. And we see in this book that that might not actually be the case at all. Often she is just as awful as her brother. She advocates bombing enemies and she is like no holds bar. She says what she feels and there is no filter on her. It's only the media perception of her that makes her sound like she's a little bit more calm and rational. And most of this book is based on fact, but there isn't as much fact about this family as we would like. So some of it is just observation and speculation. It makes for a really, really interesting read. Number 8 is The Power of Dignity by Judge Victoria Pratt. This book is about Judge Victoria's experiences in the New York City court system. She basically is dealing with lots of people coming into her court that are, struggling with low resources, low income, and being penalized for things in ways that are not constructive. And she decides that she's going to use her courtroom to lift people up instead of tear them down. She wants to focus on building dignity and respect. And so she begins to take alternate sentencing measures, making people write essays, do community service, things like that, that are geared towards lifting someone up and making them feel better about themselves. I loved the messaging around this book. I think that this was a well-needed voice. Judge Victoria Pratt is part Hispanic and part Black. And so I think she has a very unique perspective into the justice system. And I think that her empathy for the people that she's serving really shines through in her writing and her storytelling. And I really wish that our justice system in the United States would take a lead from someone like this that is so focused on rehabilitation and empathy and building dignity and respect. I think we would be a much better system if some of these rules would be applied. Number 7 is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. This is a book that draws a clear delineation between being not racist and being anti-racist. It argues that being not racist is not going far enough. You have to be actively anti-racist. You have to be fighting against racism or you're not doing enough work. I thought this book did a great job of discussing social justice and why everyone should be actively anti-racist, actively working against racist systemic structures. I also read it and didn't feel like I was being torn down or being told that I wasn't good enough. I thought that it kind of gave me a clear outline and a clear path forward in being a better ally and being more actively anti-racist in my own life. Number 6 is Horse Barbie by Geena Rocero. This is a memoir that follows Geena's life as a trans beauty pageant and then becoming a big-time New York City model and eventually even working in like music videos and acting and things like that. This is such an interesting memoir. It covers a lot of things that honestly I had never really given that much thought to before. So I loved the exploration of the trans beauty pageant scene in the Philippines and trans culture in the Philippines and the discussion of what trans culture is like for somebody in the Philippines versus coming to the United States, and how in both cases there are moments in which person feels like they might need to be closeted and also different scenarios in which they could be a little bit more open. For example, in the Philippines, it was perfectly acceptable for somebody to be a well-known and well-loved trans beauty pageant queen to walk around being trans openly without much fear of repercussion. But then there is no legal recognition from the government for that trans identity. But here in the United States, you can petition to have your name changed and gender changed and go through all the official documentation, but living openly as a trans person might make you a target for violence. I thought the juxtaposition of the two cultures and how this situation is approached was really interesting. I also thought it was super interesting when Geena went into her dating life and the challenges of approaching new relationships and whether she should disclose that she was trans or not. I had definitely considered some of the issues that might arise before, but reading it from somebody's perspective and all all of the anxiety and fear and frustration and things that come with this type of a disclosure was really, really eye-opening for me. It really gave me a bit more empathy and sympathy for the situation. And one thing I really loved about this memoir is that Geena is genuinely funny in her writing. She comes across very, very personable on the page, and it was a joy reading her writing. I thought this was a fantastic memoir. Number 5 was Cobalt Red by Siddarth. This is a book that talks about cobalt mining in the Congo. This is a depressing read. Look, this is a discussion that, should frankly make you angry. We have a country that is being exploited to the detriment of its people, especially its young people, for its resources. Congo has been exploited over and over and over again, and this is just the most recent occurrence. Basically, Siddarth goes into the Congo and he visits some of the cobalt mines, and he sees young children that are being employed to dig tunnels underground to try to mine cobalt. And he visits all sorts of different people who have been maimed and injured and are in horrible circumstances due to repercussions of mining. This isn't a pleasant book at all, but it is a very important one. It might make you think about your smart television and your smartphone and all of the products that you're buying that require cobalt and coltan to function. Number 4 is How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair. This is a memoir about Safiya's life growing up in Jamaica with a very strict conservative Rastafarian father. This was a really interesting book for me because while I know of Rastafari culture, I don't actually know the intricacies of Rastafarian culture. So this was very eye-opening for me. I learned that there were all these different types of Rastafarians and that some of them are a little bit more liberal and others are more conservative. I learned a lot about what Rastafari actually entails. So I found that fascinating. I also really enjoyed this look into Jamaican culture, the different hierarchies that exist within Jamaican culture. And then of course there is the fact that Safiya is basically fighting back against her father's heavy-handed oppression in the family. He doesn't want his daughters to be progressive. He doesn't want them to interact with certain members of society, act certain ways. He's very, very strict about how they are to dress and behave. But one thing that's really clear in Safiya from a very young age is that she's very dedicated to her education. And no matter what her father says, she's going to find ways around it to try to continue to get that education. Her dedication to her craft, to her writing, to getting to a good school was just remarkable. Her resilience as a child was remarkable. This was a very, very well-written memoir. Initially, when this book was first coming out, it was being compared to Educated by Tara Westover, and I was a little bit nervous about that comparison because I thought that was such a fantastic memoir. But having read this, I now agree. This is like a perfect comparison because it has that singular focus on education in a repressive family situation. There are a multitude of obstacles to overcome, and it is equally as fantastic. Number 3 is Fresh Banana Leaves by Dr. Jessica Hernandez. This is a book that starts a conversation around nature conservation and how Indigenous people should be brought to the table. It talks about academic snobbery and how oftentimes Indigenous communities have good plans in place for how to preserve nature or how to better our relationship with nature, but when they try to come to the academic table, they're essentially snubbed and treated like, oh, you don't have a degree, you don't have knowledge in this subject, so you have nothing of value to say. And that's a huge mistake because Indigenous communities have been living at one with nature for many, many, many years and have a lot of relevant information. It talks about all the classism in the nature conservation area. This was a really fascinating book because it does talk about nature conservation, which is an incredibly important topic, but it also talks about how nature conservation can be really racist and elitist and classist. And that's not something that I had actually considered previously. It also gives legitimate ways that Indigenous communities could be included in this conversation a little bit better, and I really appreciated that aspect. I think this is the perfect book to read alongside Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. The two of them kind of make perfect companions to each other. They're on similar topics. They discuss similar themes in terms of how the Indigenous community could benefit the academic community in terms of nature and conservation. I think that both women offer such unique perspectives, and Braiding Sweetgrass was on one of my previous best of the year lists. So I think if you read this one, read that one as well. Like, read them back to back. It just will give you a wealth of knowledge on this subject. Number 2 is Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. This was a book that was recommended to me by Hannah at Savage Reads. She mentioned that this was one of her favorite nonfiction books, and I can understand why. This book follows the Sackler dynasty as they create Purdue Pharma, and then as the second generation takes it over and starts focusing on profits. They then develop Oxycontin, and they advertise it as an alternative to Vicodin and much harsher medications. They tell doctors everywhere that this is a non-addictive narcotic painkiller that is perfect for patients that have chronic pain. They then send sales reps everywhere with all sorts of incentives. They push it through all sorts of bad testing, and essentially this gets prescribed to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, and it does turn out to be habit forming and addictive, and we end up with an Oxycontin epidemic here in the United States. This book did everything that it should. It reports on this very systematically from the beginning stages all the way to modern day. We have a clear timeline of what happened. We have a clear timeline of all of the areas where responsibility was shirked. We have a clear idea of who didn't do their jobs at all these various stages and how that leads up to this epidemic. This book made me feel so many things. I was already frustrated about this topic before I went into reading this, but honestly, after reading this, I'm infuriated. And the thing that is the most infuriating about it is that the penalties that were applied to Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family were minimal. Purdue Pharma did eventually plead guilty to one count of felony misbranding of Oxycontin, and they were fined $600 million, which put Purdue Pharma into bankruptcy. But as for the Sackler family, who was blatantly responsible for this, they were pretty much untouched. They were not claimants in the bankruptcy case. They did not get charged themselves. None of them are doing jail time. So basically a slap on the wrist for causing a huge epidemic here in the United States. Number one is The Bone Woman by Clea Koff. Clea Koff is a forensic anthropologist who specializes in studying the remains left over by genocides. She uses the evidence that she gathers for trials against the people who committed genocides. And this was such a fascinating book. So Koff was in Rwanda post-Rwandan genocide, and she was also in Sarajevo post-Bosnia and Herzegovina. She discusses how in each case, she went to specific locations, dug up bodies, identified remains, looked at methods of death, what the bones could tell her, what the situation around the bones was saying, and then created documentation that was later used in criminal trials. And then another thing that was really important about her work was giving families closure. Oftentimes in genocide, people don't know what happened to their family members. They think they might have died in this scenario, but they don't know. And all that's left is like bones and clothing and little personal items. And so by gathering those and putting them together, sometimes she is able to bring communities closure. I thought that that was a really fascinating part of this book. The thing that I liked the most about this book is that she talks about a really gruesome subject without it being extraordinarily gruesome. Like, there's no way for this to be pleasant. She's talking about genocide, but she's not going into just these graphic, horrific scenes. She's talking about it from a clinical standpoint. There are a couple moments that are a little bit gross or a little bit icky, but it wasn't a book that just left you going, oh my gosh, this is just so miserable constantly. I loved hearing about the science behind her job and how forensic anthropology makes it so much easier to try the perpetrators of genocide. This was well written, clear and concise, and about a really important subject. I think that this was a fantastic read, and it was definitely my favorite of the nonfiction reads this year. So that is the end of this video. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know what was the best nonfiction that you read this year. Or if you don't read nonfiction, what nonfiction subjects interest you enough that you might pick up a nonfiction book? And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.